All right, top 25 time. Now, I figured out a long time ago, it doesn't matter how you do your top 25, what criteria you use, how you rank the teams or whatever. Obviously, you can't please everybody with a top 25. And look, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't know that I've ever seen a top 25 that I agree with 100%. But there are a few things that is kind of a common thread that you see in terms of people complaining about the top 25. One of them is no explanations, right? Whether you're talking about a poll or a ranking is one person's poll. A poll generally is a group of people that vote and they average it out. Anyway, that doesn't matter. But one of the common kind of complaints is that there's no explanation, right? You don't know why whatever individual ranked this team 4 instead of that team, or why is team 8 behind team 7 instead of flipped around. There's no explanation. They just put the poll out or the ranking out. Hey, there it is. Like it, love it, hate it, whatever. There it is. So I always try to explain why I have the teams ranked where I do. Not because I think that I'm going to somehow convince everyone that my reasoning for having teams where I do is the correct or the right way. It's just so you know where I'm coming from and why I have a team ranked where I do. You're, of course, still free to disagree with it, but at least you'll know why I have them there. Another thing that it has bugged me for a long time about top 25 rankings and preseason rankings in particular, and I've seen tons of people over the years with this same complaint, is that having preseason rankings unfairly biases certain teams over the course of the season. For example, if you start out in the top 5 or top 10 and you lose your first game, rarely do you fall all the way out of the rankings, right? Whereas if you are ranked 22 and you lose, all of a sudden you're out of the thing, or 15 or 20 or whatever it is. So I make the most amount of changes and the most drastic changes to my top 25 early in the season, because let's be real, preseason top 25s are a complete and total guess, period. You can do all the research you want. You can look up all the stats you want on returning production or schedules and how hard they are, and this quarterback you can carry the team and all that stuff. It's 100% a guess until we start seeing games played. Once we start seeing games played, top 25s in and of themselves are still guesses, unless you've seen two teams play head to head, right? But you have actual criteria that you can at least go on to try to reasonably rank the teams. So for that reason, I make drastic changes to my top 25 early in the season based on how teams play. Winning and losing obviously being a huge factor there, but not only that, right? A team can win and still look really bad, or especially early in the season when you've got a lot of times highly ranked teams that are playing Group of 5 or FCS or severely overmatched opponents. You see a lot of point spreads that are 25, 30, 40 point games. Obviously, the favorite's going to win, right? But you can still watch that team win and come away from that game maybe even more concerned about that team than you were before based on how they play. Maybe the quarterback that in the preseason you thought was going to be really good for whatever team, you watched the first game of the season and you're like, a lot of red flags here. So maybe you want to bump a team back. And the opposite is true too. You can be way too low on teams, right? There's a lot of years where when you look at the top 10 at the end of the season, there are teams in the top 10 that were unranked in the preseason, right? So teams you think aren't going to be very good can obviously be really good. Teams you think are really good can be really bad. Top 10 teams can end up in the 20 type range. So I try to make drastic changes where needs be early in the season in my top 25 ranking. The longer the season goes on, the less drastic the changes tend to be, because you're able to better hone in on where teams should be ranked within the top 25. So with that being said, I update my top 25 every Monday during the college football season. Now, obviously, this past weekend, we only had a handful of games, and we really only had one game involving a ranked team. And of course, that was Florida State and Georgia Tech. And that's primarily what we'll talk about here, as that's really the only thing that has changed since my preseason ranking that I did 2 weeks ago. I only do 3 rankings in the offseason. I do one after signing day in February, one after the spring games, and a final preseason ranking the first or second week of August. So I did that a couple of weeks ago. But obviously, Florida State lost this past weekend in Ireland to Georgia Tech. And so I did have them in my top 25. I'll put it up in a minute. Obviously, that's going to change now. I did not have Georgia Tech ranked in my top 25. Should I put them in? I'm going to show you what I decided to do. In fact, I'll just show you right now. Here you go. Here's my Monday top 25 for, the Monday after week 0, now heading into week 1. I'll save you the trouble from going back and looking at my previous top 25. This is exactly the same as my previous top 25, except in my previous top 25, I had Florida State at 15. So to my credit, I didn't have Florida State ranked nearly as high as most other people did. They were in the top 10 of a lot of preseason polls and rankings. In fact, even the AP and the coaches, I believe, had them at number 10. I had them at 15. I caught a lot of slack from Florida State fans for having them at 15. Haven't heard much from them in the last couple of days, which is no big surprise to me. I've been doing this a long time. I know what to expect when a team loses. And I expect their fans to disappear for a while. In the case of Florida State, that's been the case. So I took Florida State all the way out of my top 25, not just because they lost, but because how they looked in that loss. Any hope, any sort of desperation that people may have had, whether they were Florida State fans or anyone else, that DJ Uiagalelei was sort of finally going to figure it out now, his 4th or 5th year in college. I think those questions were answered. We have to keep in mind, because you hear this all, well, it's just the first game, and that's true. It is just the first game. And Florida State could easily work their way back into the top 25. But when it comes to DJ in particular, yes, this is the first game of the season this year for Florida State. This is not DJ's first game. He's been playing college football. Didn't he enrolled at Clemson in 2020, right? Started a game or two, starter after that, transferred to Oregon. You know the whole story. We've seen the guy play for 3-4 years now with 3 different teams, 3 different offensive coordinators, 3 different offensive philosophies, 3 different sets of supporting cast and talent around him. Did anybody see anything in the Florida State-Georgia Tech game when it comes to DJ Uiagalelei that makes them think he's suddenly now going to be something he wasn't the last 3 or 4 years? That somehow he's going to take a huge leap forward because why? He's living in Tallahassee now as opposed to somewhere else? Because Mike Norvell is supposedly some sort of QB guru? He's not. Jordan Travis was just a good quarterback. Didn't have anything to do with Mike Norvell. Mike Norvell's been the coach at Florida State for 4 years. He's had 4 full recruiting classes, 4 stabs at the portal. Where's the quarterback that Mike Norvell, where's the young quarterback, whether it be high school or portal, whatever, that Mike Norvell has gone out and grabbed, groomed, coached, developed on the practice field under Jordan Travis for the last couple of years, that's now ready to play quarterback at Florida? Where is that person? The person doesn't exist. DJ is who DJ is. Not hating on DJ. Is he the worst quarterback in America? No, he's not. Is he going to put Florida State or any other team on his shoulders and win a game the way a Jordan Travis could? The way some of the other quarterbacks across the country can? No. I mean, he's not. And unfortunately for Florida State, they don't appear to be talented enough to get where they want to go with a quarterback like that. Some teams are. J.J. McCarthy didn't put up video game numbers. He's not what most people would considered like, one of the best quarterbacks or what. He completed a high percentage of his pass. Not knocking J.J. here at all. I'm just trying to point out the obvious difference between quarterbacks that sort of have that it factor, intangible sort of extra gear or whatever you want to call it, where they can kind of put a team on their shoulders. Joe Burrow, okay? Joe Burrow can win a game for you, multiple games for you in college. Go back and watch 2019. Stetson Bennett he needed a lot of help around him, and he had it. J.J. McCarthy needed a lot of help around him, and he had it. And to be fair, a lot of national title winning teams have quarterbacks that are more like a Stetson Bennett or a J.J. McCarthy than they are, say, a Bryce Young or a C.J. Stroud, who put up ridiculous numbers in college, are doing great in the NFL, but didn't win any titles in college, right? And then you look at Florida State and you go, there's not enough there to support somebody like DJ. So I'm concerned about Florida State going forward for this season in terms of, what their overall record may end up being. But My rankings that you see here are not a prediction of where I think teams will finish the season. I don't do my predictions that way. My predictions are solely where I feel like a team deserves to be ranked the day I make the ranking, in this case today, right? So I haven't changed anything else in my top 25 outside of moving Florida State out and moving Georgia Tech in at 25. Now, there were some other teams I considered to put in at 25, sort of, if you look at the AP poll or the coaches poll or pretty much whatever poll, they have their 1 through 25, and then they have like your others receiving votes teams, right? My ranking works generally the same way. I mean, I put 25 teams up on the screen and rank them 1 through 25. But when I'm making my notes for a video like this, I'm starting with 30, 35 teams that I, could potentially that I could potentially put into this top 25. And when you get in the 20 to 25 range, that's when I start looking at the last 15 or 20 teams I have left on my list and say, okay, which of these 5 teams can I justify putting in here to this 21 through 25 spot? And the reality is, we were either way wrong on Florida State, right? And they shouldn't have been ranked in the top 10, or in my case, the top 15. I had them 15. And they're just really, really bad, and they're atrocious, and they're going to go 7-5 and finish unranked. That's one possibility. The other possibility is they're just not quite as good as we thought they were. They're still a decent team. They're still likely to win 8 or 9 games. And that Georgia Tech is just a lot better than people were giving them credit for in the offseason. Let's not forget that Brent Key's been there for a couple of years now, and why it started a little slow. He inherited a complete mess, but it did start a little slow. He appears to be getting the most out of Haynes King. Haynes King put up really good numbers last year outside of his turnovers. If he can put up just the same numbers he put up last year, but cut the turnovers in half, that's probably good for another couple of wins for Georgia Tech, right? Brent Key is now 5-0 at Georgia Tech against ranked ACC opponents. Look at Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. One of the knocks on him at Ole Miss has been, well, he just keeps beating all the teams below him, but he can't beat any of the teams ahead of him. Well, it's been kind of the opposite for Brent Key. If you go back and look at his record in his time at Georgia Tech the last couple of years, most of the games that Brent Key has lost at Georgia Tech, particularly ACC conference games I'm talking about here, most of the games he's lost, when you look at the game, you go, that was a winnable game for Tech. Like, they probably even should have won it. And then you look at the games that they've won, and they're like all upsets. 5-0. Brent Key is at Georgia Tech against ranked ACC opponents. He was 4-0 before Saturday, not 5-0 after the win against Georgia Tech. So I think the truth between those two sort of theories, Florida State's just complete garbage and they're terrible and they'll be lucky to make a bowl game, or Georgia Tech's an elite playoff contending team now because they beat Florida State. The truth between those two contrasting opinions lies somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle. I think there's a better chance that Georgia Tech and Florida State both end up ranked in the top 25 than there is that they neither do. In other words, I think I had Florida State going 9-3 with a win over Georgia Tech. And I had Georgia Tech, I believe, going 7-5 with a loss to Florida State. Georgia Tech may go 8-4, right? Potentially 9-3. Florida State, on the other hand, who I had at 9-3, much more likely now to go 8-4, potentially 7-5 if they let this loss kind of linger and they don't improve at all, over the course of the next few weeks and months of the college football season. Everything else in my ranking, I decided to leave the same. If I really wanted to, I could have thought more about certain teams that are 1 or 2 spots apart and maybe tried to find a way to justify flipping them around. But I mean, nobody else has played yet on this list, right? I've still got Ohio State and Georgia at 1 and 2. I still think Oregon is a really talented team that can compete for the Big Ten. I've got them at 3. Texas at 4. Again, they could lose 3 or 4 games. The transition to the SEC will not be easy, but they are talented. They return Quinn Ewers, and even if something happens to him, they've got Arch Manning. Sarkisian's a great offensive mind. They've got a lot to replace there, but that Texas may be the team in my top 4 that I'm sort of least confident in, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Notre Dame at 5, I'm higher on them than everybody else is. And of course, if I'm wrong, we're going to find that out real soon because they play Texas A&M this coming weekend. And for some reason, Texas A&M is favored in that game by a couple of points. Notre Dame should beat them. Period. First-year head coach at A&M. Terrible last 2 or 3 years for A&M. Complete turnover of the roster down there. Notre Dame should go down there and win that game, especially if they're a top 5 team like I have here. If they don't, they're likely not a playoff team at all, in my opinion. Because where do you think, if you're watching this video, where do you think Texas A&M is going to finish in the SEC? 5th, 6th, 7th? What? So if Notre Dame loses this game, let's say they only lose one more game the rest of the year. They're sitting there at the end of the season at 10-2. But one of those losses is to the 6th or 7th place team in the SEC. And the playoff committee is sitting in a room going, well, should we put in this 9-3 SEC team that finished 3rd in the SEC? Or should we put in this 10-2 Notre Dame team who got beat by the 7th place team in the SEC? It could really cost Notre Dame to lose this game at Texas A&M. I've got them winning, but 4-5 here. You can even throw Georgia in there if you want. Georgia's got the toughest game of my top 4 this coming weekend. They play Clemson. Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas basically all play nobodies this weekend. They should win no problem. Georgia's got the best chance of losing of anybody in my top 4, but even Georgia's a 14-point favorite this weekend and should win. Notre Dame at Texas A&M is the other interesting game within the top 5, so we'll see what happens with my top 5 next week based on what happens primarily in the Georgia-Notre Dame game. Alabama at 6 and Ole Miss at 7. That could easily be flip-flopped. Those are, I think that's about right for those two. Michigan at 8. That may end up being a little bit too high. I still have a ton of faith in Michigan's defense. I think they're going to win a lot more games than they lose. We'll see. Oklahoma State at 9 and Utah at 10. I'm higher on those two than a lot of other people. If you look inside other people's top 10, well, Florida State, for one, was in a lot of other people's top 10. I clearly didn't have that. I had Florida State at 15. But Penn State, Missouri, are some other teams you see in some people's top 10. I've got them a little bit further down. Penn State plays West Virginia. Not the toughest week 1 game of any team in the top 15, but a legitimate opponent there. They got to play them there in Morgantown. We'll see how that goes, right? With a win, maybe Penn State moves up a spot or two. With a loss, clearly they would fall. And we'll see how they look. Miami and Florida, of course, play this week. Florida's unranked and not expected to have a very good record. But again, you look at the point spread on that Miami-Florida game, very small. A couple of points difference there. Miami plays them there. I expect Miami to win. I think Miami's the better team. Miami should go in there and win. For some reason they don't. You can expect them to fall out of the rankings too. Tennessee, you got to wait till week 2 to see anything really from them when they play NC State, which I think will be a really good team. You can see I got Tennessee at 15, NC State at 19. So that'd be rank versus rank for Tennessee here in a couple of weeks. Clemson, we mentioned, plays Georgia. Oklahoma plays Temple, I think on Thursday or Friday, but I think it's Friday. They're 40-point favorites, blow them out. LSU plays Southern Cal this weekend. I have picked Southern Cal to win the game. And let me take this opportunity to make another point about my top 25. I try to keep my opinion on what will happen in the future out of my top 25 because I just don't think that's a fair way to do it. Because my opinion on what might happen is 50-50 at best. So I think LSU is going to lose to Southern Cal. But I can't make any rational explanation at all in the preseason for having Southern Cal ranked ahead of LSU. I just can't. If I sat here for an hour, I wouldn't be able to even convince myself why I think right now Southern Cal should. Any argument I would make about Southern Cal being ranked ahead of LSU would have to involve me thinking Southern Cal is going to beat LSU in 5 days or whatever it is. And I try to keep what might happen in the future out of my ranking. So I've got LSU at 18, but I've picked them to lose to Southern Cal this week. And if that happens, they'll drop. Southern Cal would probably come into the top 25. Same way I put Georgia Tech in after beating a top 15 Florida State team, right? I've got Louisville at 20, Kansas at 21, Iowa State at 22, Arizona at 23, and Virginia Tech at 24. Virginia Tech is the other one that, I'm higher on them than everybody else. They're not in a lot of top 25. They're not in a lot of top 25 rankings. I'd have Iowa would be close. If you want to know like who's 26, who's 27, who's 28, I don't rank that, but I do have like another group of teams written down here that I always consider for the 21 through 25 spot. So it would be a Florida State at 0-1, and Iowa, who could have another good year this year. And then you start getting into, some group of 5 schools, Memphis, who interestingly enough plays Florida State here in a couple of weeks. Of course, Mike Norvell used to coach at Memphis. That'll be a very interesting game. And it just got a lot more interesting with Florida State already sitting on the 1 loss to Georgia Tech. But Memphis, UTSA, Boise, Liberty, Tulane, whichever kind of group of 5 team you kind of think might come out of the pack there. Those would be the teams, if I did a top 30, that would be sort of in line next to come into this top 25. But there you go. Just the one change today. Again, I don't expect everybody to agree with my rankings. And please keep in mind that in the first couple of weeks of the college football season, I make drastic changes to try to correct what I was wrong about. I clearly was, I was wrong. Florida State did not look like one of the best 15 teams in the country on Saturday, and I had them ranked at 15. So I've corrected that now. It would be ridiculous for me to leave Florida State at 15 or move them down to 16. They didn't look like the 16th best team or the 20th best team. So again, they sort of are at a disadvantage because we haven't seen the other teams play. I mean, who knows? Maybe one of these teams here, or a couple more of these teams here come out and just look really, really bad. And you go, well, man, I shouldn't have them ranked either. Drastic changes to the top 25 in the first couple of weeks of the season to try to correct what I was wrong about in ranking the teams to start with in the preseason. But there you go. Florida State went from number 15 to unranked. Georgia Tech from unranked to 25. Appreciate you watching. Leave a comment down below. Let me know where you think I'm wrong, and have a good morning.